I start many of my interviews asking people a question that I like, which is, where is home, or what is home to you? And I feel like you're the culmination of all these questions, because you literally start with an entire chapter on what is home. So how would you answer that now?
That is an interesting question, and it's definitely lots of places. So when I was writing the book Hello Stranger, I was thinking about places I feel at home, and particularly actually in cities. I tend to be pretty much a city dweller, even though I was brought up in rural, small town Norfolk in the UK. But particularly in cities where I think there's a multiplicity of ways of belonging, which I always find is one of the draws of a city. You can belong to a city in different ways. So there's lots of cities where I feel at home, and my current base is in Sofia, Bulgaria, and I see it certainly somewhere I'm at home and somewhere that is home at the moment, but there are also all kinds of other places where I feel quite deeply at home. Leicester, for example, where I was before I was in Bulgaria. I've spent quite a lot of time in Yangon, in Chengdu, and various other places. And all of those places, when I rock up there after an absence, there's a sense of, to some extent, coming home.
So it is very much possible in your mind to have multiple homes, to feel at home in a lot of different places.
I think so. I mean, it gets complicated when you have to tussle with bureaucracy. And as you probably know yourself, bureaucracy is not massively imaginative. So you have to have one place that is home, and identity has to be single and all of those other things. So, I mean, from a bureaucratic point of view, home is my sister's house in the UK, where I've never lived, because she opens my mail and, WhatsApps me anything interesting. But and bureaucratically, that's my home. But I think in terms of sort of broader human belonging, I mean, it really is multiple.
That kind of gets to what is home, how we define home from very early on. I mean, you talk in your book about, you go back to the ancient Greeks, right? Because you're a philosopher, and so there's a lot of philosophy in there.
Yeah.
But that concept of home, it kind of starts, as soon as humanity starts, doesn't it?
I think so. And there's different ways you can think about home. So you can think about home as a space and as a territory, if you like. But you can also think about home as a set of social networks of belonging. And I think that the latter sense of home is something that goes very, very deep at all. I mean, for example, within more nomadic communities, home, both past and present, home may be more defined by those enduring social connections, or perhaps the particular lines of flight or routes that you take through the world, rather than belonging to a particular single geography or territory. So I think that sense of belonging and home as belonging is something that is, and that belonging as being social is something that goes back to very, very earliest human times.
That's interesting for the modern immigrant or the modern nomad, because for a long time, when you left forever, and those social connections were severed, were broken just by virtue of distance, right? So that kind of multiple homes, multiple belonging, like you and I have, is a pretty recent phenomenon, isn't it? Because it just was impossible before, technically.
I think it is relatively recent. I mean, there's sort of examples, say, from I include a bit of Chinese poetry in the book, and this sense of connections that endure over a distance, which is very strongly a part of the Chinese poetic tradition, and meeting and parting poems, and that sense of saying farewell to people, and then people being a long way away and actually never having a sense of when you're going to see them again. So it's not But there is that sense of enduring connection still, even pre all of these tools we have today to keep in touch. And obviously letters and things could still be sent, quite in the quite distant past. So there are those threads of connection still, but I think it's much easier to maintain, obviously, those multiple kinds of belonging now because of the ways we can, in different countries, we can chat face to face like we're doing now. And that's a relatively new thing. I mean, in the early 90s, I talk a lot about being in Pakistan in the early 90s and traveling as a incredibly naive teenager and experiencing what was the most astonishing hospitality and actually the effect that had on me when I was incredibly vulnerable and utterly out of my depth, to be honest, in small towns in Pakistan. And back then, it was really quite hard to keep in touch with people back home. I'd go to a post office and pick up a pile of mail post restant, that some of which had been sent 2 months ago. And then that would be the only communication I had for another 6 weeks or something till I got to the next post office and got them to rummage for this next pile of mail.
There's a poetry to this kind of traveling that I think we've lost in a way. I remember being in an Uber in Bangalore a few years ago, and I wasn't quite sure where my driver was taking me, or I wanted to check, that we were on the right path and that I wasn't being taken for a ride. I opened my phone and opened the map and kind of spotted where I was and where I was going, and I just had this moment of, wow, technology is amazing. I'll never again be lost in a foreign city. And then I had this deep sadness all of a sudden. I was, wow, I'll never again be lost in a foreign city.
I think that is absolutely true, and that sense of quite some deep estrangement or being lost is not something that's so easy to come by, and it's something that I do remember I relished, and I still a few years ago I went to a conference in Prague. I kept my phone switched off, and I turned up there. I booked into where I was staying, and the day after, I just went for a stroll in the morning. The conference was starting that evening, sat on the bench, and it was very foggy, and it kind of looked like Franz Kafka was about to loom out of the mist. It was that kind of Prague weather. And I realized that nobody there knew me, and nobody knew where I was, and felt an incredible sense of, I think, just the joy of being alone, actually, and the joy of being somewhere where I was quite unconnected. And that was quite interesting. But I also knew I could turn my phone on, and then suddenly the texts and the messages would come in.
And that happened really quickly, because, you talk about your post-restant in Pakistan. I was in an exchange student in the US in 2001. And even then, I think, called my family 3 or 4 times during the year. And we had emails, but it was fairly disconnected, as opposed to kids doing the same thing today who are on Facebook, and in a way you can be physically somewhere, but your mind can stay back where you used to be, right?
But I also think there's we sort of tend to think about being elsewhere and keeping those connections with home. But for me, one of the amazing, wonderful things about all of these ways of connecting really are that it's really possible to sustain connections in places that I've spent time that have temporarily been my home, but are my home no longer. So a lot of friends still in Myanmar, in Yangon and elsewhere in Myanmar, are still in touch regularly, and particularly given what's been going on there over the last year since the coup, that's just been really, really positive to actually keep those connections alive. So it's not just that sort of reaching back to your place of origin for connections, a sense of connection. It's also sustaining those other connections you make along the way.
You mentioned your time in Yangon. You were also in Pakistan as a young man for a long while. And I have to say, when I was reading those passages, I was a bit jealous, because it is a way of being in the world that is privilege, I mean, that word is overused, but, I was thinking about how I am in the world and how, that kind of traveling. I've done a bit of it in my early 20s, and as many wonderful memories as I've had, I also had some really scary experiences with strangers. And that has made me pull back, and not travel in the same way that I used to. And so, yeah, a part of me, reading your book was thinking about, who has the opportunity, who has the privilege of that connection with stranger and the richness that comes from it, because there's also danger in it, and there's danger in it for everyone, but for some more than others. And in fact, traditionally, it was mostly men traveling on their own and going on these kinds of adventures, while women are more rooted to the home, and to the safety associated with the home. How do you? I don't know if there's a
Yeah.
question there, but how do you think about that?
No, I think it's a really interesting, it's a really interesting question. And the first thing to say, I mean, we're talking about gender, and the first thing to say about gender is actually, and it's something I do talk about in the book, a lot of our concerns about strangers in general, when you boil them down, they're concerns about male strangers. Because whether you're, however you identify gender-wise, it is actually male strangers who are the greatest risk. And babies know this. Babies will be more spooked out by male strangers than by women strangers. Also, that's the same elsewhere in the animal kingdom. With other primates, their risk comes from adult males, more so than adult females. And so, the first thing to say about those kind of gender dynamics is that's really where the risk lies. And it's something that I think we don't necessarily give enough attention to. I mean, we don't generally give enough attention to the fact that men tend to be a greater risk than women, and that gender is a huge factor in terms of people's capacity, particularly say for violence. So, and that's one of the things we're afraid about when we're talking about strangers. So that's the first thing. I think the second thing is there may be, and I was talking to my editor about this when we were writing the book, and the data is sort of interesting on this, but there may be more of a split between the safety of the home and the risk of the outside if you are male identifying than if you are female identifying. So we all know that actually, despite the notion of home as a place of safety, that for many women it's not at all. And that's more the case for women than men. So in a sense, risk is more evenly distributed, I think, if you're a woman than if you're a man. So there's a sense in which if you're a man and you're at home, you're safer, and if you're outside, you're less safe. And the main threat to men in the outside world is obviously other men. But if you're a woman, the figures suggest that the threat is more evenly distributed between inside and outside. So that's one thing. That's a whole complex set of questions. And we're all of us, depending on gender, class, race, all kinds of other things, vulnerable in different ways and in different specific circumstances as well. So there's the question of what we do about that vulnerability if we're making those decisions. And the thing that the book is really interested in, I was really interested in the book, was the tension between that response towards strangers where we're curious and interested and want to find out more and want to connect, and that response to strangers where we're afraid and we're wanting to close down. any sense of connection and to withdraw. And on the one hand, there's what the Greeks call Philoxenia, which is literally the sort of friendship with the stranger, with the xenos, but friendship, desire to connect with that which is strange or different or new to us. And on the other side, there's xenophobia, which is that fear of what is strange or new to us. And it strikes me that both of those responses are very much inbuilt. I mean, a cat has the same thing. And when somebody comes to visit you and the cat sees somebody new, they may be a little bit curious, but they may also hide behind the sofa. So hiding behind the sofa is sort of xenophobia, it's fear of the stranger, but sticking your head out and just kind of checking them out and wanting to connect and find out how they work, that's philoxenia. And both of those responses are actually to do quite deeply with safety. So the idea often is that the more we close down towards strangers, the safer we become. But I think that's probably not true for any of us. And there is safety in withdrawal in certain circumstances, but there's also safety and greater security in connecting. And so one of the things I think is interesting, just to sort of finish this thought, and I was talking to somebody at a book festival I was doing last week, the writer Lee Randall, and we were talking about being on the train, and if somebody, as a woman being on the train, some strange man sits down opposite you and starts behaving strangely, you might move to another carriage. But another strategy of responding to that is to connect with other people in the carriage, to start building some kind of sense of social safety through connection that can offset that sense of risk. So I think that conundrum of connect or disconnect, and how to manage your relationships with strangers through withdrawing or going towards them is one of the ways for all of us we manage questions of safety, because we're all vulnerable in different ways, and there are particular issues and concerns as a woman. But as an 18-year-old kid in Pakistan, there are all kinds of interesting vulnerabilities there as well, I think.
Absolutely.
I mean, we might come back in a bit to questions of how that plays out in households as well, because I'll say something now. Yeah.
No, please.
So I think also one of the interesting things I was talking about in the book was the East Indonesian Manggarai households that are very porous, and the sense of a household where, so this is in Flores in Indonesia, and the houses are made of bamboo slats, or were until relatively recently, open to the world. People who wander in could wander out. Cooking smells come in and out. Smoke seeps through the walls. You can call out to people, I love this, in the next door house, and you can say, sleep well to the people in the next door house. Which is great. And there's this sense that through living in that kind of more porous way, there is a kind of protective social heat. And the Indonesian word is ramai, which is kind of bustling heat and social heat and fun and cracking jokes together and that kind of thing. And that porosity is something that sustains that. And I wonder whether also that one of the problems in terms of how we live now is that without that porosity, that also makes the home less safe. So if you have that sense of broader social connection that doesn't stop at the boundaries of the home, then that does open up the possibility of the home becoming a site of violence, if you like. But if you have that coming and going, that broader sense of social connection, then there are other forces to offset that.
You don't end up isolated in your home from the community. It really is a very cultural thing because, I kind of had the same experience living in a studio in Paris with paper thin walls, and I could hear the neighbors. I could hear the neighbor's phone on vibrate, and that could be, oh, community. You've got a friend across the wall, really, but often it felt like an invasion. Like
Yeah.
there was no privacy, there was no intimacy, within that. Again, going back to that sacred sense of that inviolable home, that place that is yours and where you are protected from strangers, from the state, from anyone who would try to reach in.
But I think that notion of the inviolable home is quite culturally specific.
Mm-hmm.
So
sound very Western, is what you say.
I mean, possibly it doesn't sound like a Manggarai home, and it doesn't sound like the homes I stayed in further east in the Nimbus Islands in Indonesia when I was doing field work. But it also doesn't sound particularly like the home I grew up in, which was a vicarage. My father was a local priest. And this was a building that wasn't owned by us. So it was owned by the church. And it was a place that was also a workplace, a place where people came to meet and do things. And there were always people coming and going. And it didn't feel like we were, I think as I say in the book, we didn't have sole claim on the place. So my own sense of home has always been as something that is a bit more porous. And I'm not sure that inviolable sacred spaces ultimately are things that make us safer, actually.
Yeah. No, I do love this idea of connection as the thing that keeps you safe, rather, and this idea, again, going back to earlier days of traveling, when we didn't have the technology and infrastructure that we have now. So the only way to travel is to rely on the kindness of strangers that open their homes along the way, right, as you progress in the world.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, when I was back in Pakistan in the early 90s, very often that was how I had to travel. I was in all kinds of places I shouldn't have been. And people tended to sort of see me as somebody who was clearly vulnerable, exposed, and needed protection, but also somebody for whom they felt responsible. So quite often I would go somewhere, somebody would end up putting me up and would phone their second cousin in the next place I was going to, and I would then take the bus, and they would meet me off the bus. So, and from that point of view, I think I sort of had those, I entered into those sort of networks of connection and felt a little bit safer myself. But there was also something just exhilarating about turning up somewhere and just having no idea where you're going to stay or what encounters you're going to have. As you say, there's a kind of privilege to that exhilaration.
And but it is something that kind of, everyone, or every culture at least, experiences, and in fact has rituals for, which you describe, rituals for how you welcome a stranger in, how you open your door, what the rules are for the hosts and for the guests. And there are, it seems, connections across every human culture of, sharing food and drink, laying down your weapons, phrases that you say, things that are that I recognize in French culture, and that you describe in cultures in Pakistan and in all over the world, really, in Mongolia, and we connect in that, and that we can all recognize what it is to welcome a stranger to your home.
Yeah, and I think that's the thing of welcoming other strangers into your own world or your own home is the other side, because it's easy to think a lot of the book is about, or draws on, my travels elsewhere. But it's easy to think from that strangers are people you have to go elsewhere to meet. But one of the things I think is really interesting is that when it comes down to it, pretty much most of the 8 point whatever billion people on the planet are strangers. So you don't have to go anywhere. The problem of dealing with strangers is a problem you're going to run into sooner or later. If you're in a city, it's a problem you run into every time you take the subway or walk down the street. Even if you live up some, remote mountainside, some hermit existence, there's always going to be somebody rocking up who's going to kind of break with your solitude and nice little world you've built up and cause you all kinds of problems. So the issue of dealing with strangers really does feel a fundamental human one, and it's not something you can't get rid of strangers. And I think that's one of the things that I was most interested in writing the book, because there's an idea in popular culture that somehow certain groups of people are strangers and you keep those people at bay, and then everybody else gets on with their life and everybody's in place, and if everybody stays in the right place, then the world will be wonderful and harmonious. But that's not how we work. And even those people who are not designated as strangers, they're people we don't know. They're people we don't have any idea what's going on in their heads or what they get up to. So strangers are everywhere, and we can't avoid running into them. And so this brings in, as you say, the idea of ritual as something that is a way of managing those, particularly those first encounters, but not just that, also sustaining, I think, connections through time. And it's something that does seem to me to be universal, except the rituals are very different in different places. So in the book, I talk a lot about Mongolian rituals, and out on the grasslands of Mongolia, there used to be very strict oral codes of how you relate to your host or how you relate to your guest to ensure everybody's safety. But even in the UK, where I'm originally from, rituals like how you knock on the door, offering cups of tea, are incredibly deep-rooted. And if somebody comes round to visit you and you offer them a cup of tea, if you're British, and they come in and they say, no thanks, and you think that's a bit strange, so you offer them coffee, because that's kind of okay, and they say no thanks. You offer them water, they say no thanks. They just sit there without a drink. That is weirdly unsettling. And it's weirdly unsettling because I think the purpose of the ritual is really to build connection rather than to slake thirst. And if somebody's not playing that game, then we don't quite know how to deal with them.
Mm-hmm.
So those sort of subtle of dances of ritual, I think, are really incredibly fascinating. But they were something we do very naturally, and something that is an incredibly important part of building trust with strangers.
And can lead to some funny lost in translation moments when you don't understand the ritual that's being proposed to you.
It's true. I do remember going to stay with two French sisters in Paris. And it was through the couchsurfing website, and Ellie, my partner back then, and I thought we'd get some chocolates. And I don't know if you know those Booja Booja chocolates, which are posh British chocolates, in a little kind of round balsa wood box, which we thought, oh, those would be nice as a gift. We turned up, and the sisters looked at this box. They said, camembert. It's a camembert. It's like, and then they opened it and it was chocolates. And this look of confusion flickered across their face, almost as if somehow we were trolling them or this was some joke. And then we said, oh no, they're chocolates. And they shrugged and put them on a high shelf, never to mention them again. And we felt somehow that this was the wrong gift, and that after that things were a little bit awkward. And when we left, we bought them flowers, and only after that did we feel that we'd restored the balance that the curious gift of, chocolates masquerading as camembert had caused.
Oh, that's funny. That's funny. Yeah, you were talking about you can't avoid the stranger, and who is a stranger to us. Um, One thing that brought up for me is actually who is a stranger is very much dependent on your context, right? So um, if I'm going around London, someone who's from Crouch End, which is where I am, it somehow feels more like kin than some other Londoner. But if I'm traveling around the world, um, you don't even need to be French. Pretty much anyone who's European feels like less of a stranger. So we find ways somehow, wherever we are, whatever context we are, to divide the world between the strangers and the slightly less strangers that we have something, however mythical, however imagined, in common with.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there are also kind of concentric circles of, there's those really close to us and those who we feel we have enduring connections with, and those people who we kind of imagine are quite like us. And then we get to know them, we find they're not at all, and that causes all kinds of disappointment or hilarity or whatever. And then there are people who we imagine are not like us, and occasionally you discover they're more like you than you think, once you start connecting. But we do, I think, have those concentric circles of how we imagine belonging. And I don't think it's a thing you can necessarily eradicate. I don't think it's a necessarily bad thing, but I think it's always worth recognizing that those sketch maps of humanity are provisional and almost certainly wrong.
Mm-hmm. But there is something to that. Finding something that you share with the stranger that you meet that makes them less of a stranger. Um, there is something wonderful that the stranger brings. Is not just connection, but um, news from the outside,
Yep.
right? The stranger is the one that connects you, not just to themselves, but to everyone else that they've met before, right? And just continues that. I mean, it used to be that's how news
Yeah.
spread, right? Before we had the kind of media that we have today.
So I did my PhD way back in philosophy on Emmanuel Levinas, the Lithuanian French philosopher. And Levinas is obsessed by this idea of the stranger, and it's at the center of his quite complicated approach to ethics and the ethics of responsibility. But he says somewhere that the stranger brings me more than I can contain. And I love that idea, and the idea that there's something in those encounters which is more than you can contain, it's more than you can encompass in your view of the world. And therefore, you have to some extent, let that your own sort of view of the world and your own mastery of the world slacken a bit, because there's something new here and something unexpected, and something. He talks about it also as the stranger brings us the future, because they're new possibilities that we couldn't possibly imagine, and those may not always be good. But who wants to be trapped in the future only of the possibilities they themselves could imagine? That would be a kind of hell, I think. So we also need strangers, I think, because of that newness they bring.
Mm-hmm. And that openness and
Yeah.
that discovery that you get from meeting strangers. I think one of the more valuable experiences I had as a kid and as a teenager, as a young woman, was we brought foreign exchange students into our home. So I was one myself in the US,
Yeah.
but we also had many through the years stay with our family. And there was something incredibly awkward at first,
Yeah.
literally integrating a perfect stranger into your family life, but incredibly enriching as well.
Yeah. I mean, I think also it's also often incredibly inconvenient. And again, it's something that I was interested in looking at in the book, is the way that actually it's quite disruptive, it's quite inconvenient, potentially full of risks, but it's usually if things work out well, it's an inconvenience worth having, I think.
Yeah, I mean, growth only comes from discomfort, right? I think.
I think it's one of the places it comes from.
For one of the
I'd have to
places.
think about that for a lot longer to think about whether it only comes from discomfort, but it's definitely one of the places. Yeah,
that was definitely a bit of a categorical statement. I'm not sure if I believe it myself. It certainly is one of the places that it comes from. To kind of wrap up this conversation, I was curious if you could chat about why decide to tackle this topic now, or write this book now about the value of strangers.
I think the most obvious reason is that there's quite a strong cultural fear, particularly in the UK, of the idea of strangers and strangers as only offering risk and threatening to make our world worse if we invite them in. And to me, that seems an enormous missed opportunity, and all the evidence seems to be that is an enormous missed opportunity. But also in that sense that strangers present us with risk and danger and could disrupt our world in ways that we fear, is not a wholly unreasonable one either. So I was interested by thinking through this idea of what it means for us as human beings to encounter people we don't know and to experience that sense of vulnerability in the face of people we don't know. And what's going on in that sort of in this, for example, what's going on in that politics of unwelcome, if you like, which is to some extent quite widespread. And the opposite of that is often a slightly over-optimistic view that all encounters with strangers are good and that we should just welcome everybody all the time, and that xenophobia is some kind of vice in need of eradication. And I think that's not plausible, and that actually a sense of some kind of anxiety in the face of the unknown and in the face of people we don't know is something that is not just ineradicable, but also is probably one of the things that we need to get by in the world. So what I wanted to do was give enough sort of space to that fear we have in the face of strangers, whilst also thinking about what are the other things that are going on, and particularly this idea of philoxenia, the idea of curiosity, desire to connect, fascination, which I think is no less deeply rooted than xenophobia, and is the opposite sort of forward-moving rather than backward-moving aspect of our connections with strangers, and that is also, like xenophobia, is also born out of a desire to make our world better and safer and more secure so that we can flourish. And so I was really interested by how between those two things we navigate the difficulties we have as human beings, trying to get to grips with living in a world where people are incredibly mobile, where we live in cities where a lot of the people we're surrounded by are people we don't know and will never know, and where we run into strangers hundreds of times, thousands of times a day. So how can we sort of think better about the complexity of those encounters to give a little more space to the responses that might help build more of a sense of belonging, connectivity, more of a sense of fun even, because I think that's really important, more of a sense of possibility and a way of looking towards building a better future rather than just seeing this as some a sort of inner radical problem that we somehow have to manage by, I don't know, battening down the hatches, or alternatively by throwing out our xenophobia altogether, which is never going to happen.
Right. Well, thank you so much for this wonderful conversation. You've given me my new favorite word, by the way, philoxenia. I hadn't heard it before.
It's a lovely word, isn't it? Yeah.
It really is. I think it's going to be my new motto. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Isabel. It's been a pleasure.